My name is Dr. Raoul McLaughlin. My subject is trade beyond the imperial frontiers and the economy of ancient Rome. This is part 2 of a talk on the 2nd century disaster that signaled a decline in Roman prosperity. The question is, how did Galen describe the Great Fire of Rome? Historians have long been fascinated by the First Great Fire of Rome, which occurred in AD 64 during the reign of Emperor Nero. But until now, little attention has been given to the inferno that swept through Rome in AD 192 during the reign of another notorious Roman ruler, Emperor Commodus. The recent discovery of a lost manuscript, written by the famous Roman doctor Galen, called On the Avoidance of Grief, provides new insight into the origin and consequences of this disaster. Until now, our best surviving account of the Great Fire of AD 192 was provided by the Roman consul and historian Dio Cassius, who lived through these events. Dio writes, "There were ill omens before the death of Commodus, for many eagles soared above the capital and uttered screams that boded nothing peaceful. An owl was heard to screech in the night, moments before a fire began in some dwelling and leapt onto the Temple of Peace. From there it swept through the storehouses of Egyptian and Arabian products." The eagle was symbolic of Roman authority, and the owl sacred to Athena. Their cries of alarm in the skies above Rome foretold great misfortune for the empire. Dio attests that the flames that engulfed the Temple of Peace were carried aloft as far as the Palatine Hill, where the blaze reached the imperial palace. It destroyed extensive portions of the building and incinerated nearly all the state records. Galen's letter offers a new account of the fire and a different insight into its origins as it spread through the sacred heart of Rome. In Galen's version of events, the blaze reached the spice warehouses first. These were the monumental buildings that stored foreign imports from Arabia and India. The fire then swept along the sacred way, up to the Temple of Peace. From there the flames spread to the Palatine Hill and the imperial palace. The blaze was fueled by hundreds of tons of incense stored in the Horea Peperataria, the pepper and spice warehouses. These precious substances were closely connected with divine offerings, and the acrid smoke that curled high into the night air would have been fragrant with all the perfumes of Arabia. This encouraged the belief that the fire had a supernatural origin and an unearthly purpose. Onlookers might well have thought that the entire Horea Peperataria was offering itself up to the gods in a colossal and terrifying blaze. Dio Cassius certainly believed that the fire had a supernatural aspect. It was important from the gods that Commodus was due to die and ruin of the empire was imminent. The historian Herodian, who was a young man in Rome at the time of the fire, also believed that the blaze was no accident. He mentions other strange omens before the fire, including stars that remained visible throughout the day. Drawing upon popular reports, he described the fire thus: "There was no massing of dark clouds, but a preliminary earth tremor was felt. There was no thunderstorm present when either a bolt of lightning struck or a fire broke out as a result of the tremor. The entire Temple of Peace, the largest and most beautiful of all the buildings in the city, was burnt to the ground." As if directed by some divine power, the blaze spread to the Temple of Vesta, the sacred hearth of ancient Rome. Herodian describes the terrifying scene. He writes, "When the Temple of Vesta went up in flames, the image of Pallas Athena was exposed to public view. That statue which the Romans worshipped and keep hidden, the one brought from Troy. Now for the first time the statue has been seen by men of our time. The Vestal Virgin snatched up the image and fled with it along the sacred way to the imperial palace. But the all-consuming conflagration followed their flight into the palace. The Romans must have watched in horror as the destructive fire merged with the sacred vestal flames to consume their city. The fire burned for days, and it seemed that no human agency could extinguish the blaze. Dio Cassius describes the frantic efforts made by vast numbers of civilians and soldiers. They carried water to hurl upon the ground in front of the approaching fire, and to dampen the walls of burning buildings. Even Commodus came to encourage the crowds, but to no avail. Suddenly the weather changed, and heavy rain showers fell upon the city. Herodian writes, "For this reason it was known that the disaster was indeed of divine origin, for people now believed that the fire was started and stopped by the will and power of the gods." Only when the blaze was extinguished did people begin to understand their loss. Dio Cassius describes the Temple of Peace as the richest of all the sacred buildings in Rome. It contained a vast treasure trove of gold and silver artifacts in a temple complex lined with colonnades made from the finest marble. This precinct was thought to be the most secure location in the city, and it had therefore functioned as an important depository where people could safely store their private funds. Many people had their most valuable possessions held in the temple for safekeeping when the blaze struck. They lost their savings, and some lost entire fortunes in this single calamity. Dio Cassius reports that everyone used the temple as a deposit for their best possessions. In a single night, the fire sent rich men into poverty. Everyone joined together in mourning the destruction of a public edifice, but each person was also lamenting their own personal ruin. People speculated that the destruction of the Temple of Peace was a harbinger of war. The smell of burnt incense resembled a vast funeral offering, and Dio Cassius ominously adds that the destruction of these warehouses full of foreign goods signaled that the coming evil would encompass the entire world. Herodian says that people no longer supported Commodus and attributed their misfortunes directly to the emperor. Galen's experience, recorded in his letter home to Pergamum, typifies the distress felt by many people after the Great Fire. Galen was already at his new country residence in Campania when he heard about the disaster. The fire was a personal tragedy, for Galen had temporarily placed many of his most precious possessions in the private storeroom he rented in the Horea Peperitaria for safekeeping while he moved house. This included valuable financial assets such as gold coins, expensive silverware, and acknowledgments of debts owed to him. But the real loss felt by Galen was the destruction of his research materials, including a great number of books, specialist remedies, and a diverse range of unique medical instruments. Galen was planning to collect these possessions from the storeroom at the start of summer, and, if the fire had only occurred 2 months later, then his research would have arrived safely at his new home. Galen observes, "Thus fate laid a trap for me, depriving me of many of my medical books. I also suffered further significant loss, the study of vocabulary that I had collected from ancient Athenian comedy." Galen's letter reveals how medical professionals used the outer storerooms of the spice warehouses. He describes how he carefully stockpiled a unique collection of rare ingredients and exceptional medical preparations in his personal storeroom. Some of these substances were from the imperial palace and had been acquired by Galen when he prepared medicines for Marcus Aurelius. This included a large quantity of high-quality medical cinnamon that Galen thought he would never be able to replace. Galen considered these expensive medical supplies to be fundamental to his profession and irreplaceable through dealings with private merchants. The research that Galen lost in the fire included original copies of the first 2 books of his medical study on the composition of drugs according to kind. Other research destroyed in the blaze included many notes and investigations. In a further work called On My Books, Galen writes, "I was still engaged in research on some topics, and I wrote a lot in connection with these studies. I was training myself in the solution of all sorts of medical and philosophical problems, but I lost most of this material in the Great Fire." In his letter on the avoidance of grief, Galen offers additional details about his research and its significance to his early career. He explains how, as a young doctor, he inherited important medical papers collected by eminent physicians from his home city. One of these compendiums included specialist formulas that had been purchased for more than 100 gold pieces each. A further personal collection from a senior doctor named Tethras contained medical remedies gathered from all over the world and owned by no other person. When Tethras died from the Antonine Plague in AD 165, Galen became sole benefactor of this knowledge. As a young doctor, Galen had built up his medical practice using these studies. He recalls in his letter, "If someone owned an important remedy, I was able to acquire it without much difficulty. I just exchanged it for 2 or 3 comparable remedies from these collections." But after the fire, Galen was left with only the small number of remedies he had brought to Campania and the formulas he had freely entrusted to other doctors. The flames that engulfed the storerooms of the spice warehouses had therefore destroyed an irreplaceable wealth of his professional knowledge. Galen had also placed his medical equipment in the storeroom before he moved house, and this included unique instruments that he had carefully designed and crafted himself to perform specific operations. These items were destroyed, and Galen recalled that every day afterwards he felt the need of a book, or an ingredient, or some remedy, only to realize that it was gone. Yet this personal loss was part of a greater tragedy, as Galen explains in his letter. He writes, "Yet I have not mentioned the most terrible thing, for there was no hope of replacing my lost collection of books. For all the libraries on the Palatine Hill were burnt on that same day." Many other professionals must have suffered similar losses in this great fire. In grounds close to the spice warehouses were the Herrea Vespiana. This was a colossal warehouse built to store merchandise taxed from Egyptian estates. It too burned as the fire swept along the sacred way, incinerating great stockpiles of linen and papyri. Scholars had chosen to keep their research in storerooms near this facility, and these works were also consumed in the blaze. Some academics lost a lifetime of research, knowledge, and inquiry. Galen speaks of Philippides, the grammarian, who died soon after his precious books were destroyed in the fire. Some people said that he had been overwhelmed with despair and pain from his loss. In fact, everyone affected by the destruction wandered around for a long time dressed in black cloaks, some appearing thin and pale, and all looking like people in mourning. The fire heralded a new era of insecurity and hardship for the people of Rome. In the aftermath, Commodus declared himself to be a new Romulus and vowed to rebuild the sacred heart of the city. But his actions bounded on megalomania, and he planned to rename the great institutions of state in his own honor, with Rome itself becoming known as the Colonia Commodina. Within a year, conspirators had persuaded Commodus' personal wrestling trainer to strangle him. The Praetorian Guard appointed a man named Pertinax as their new emperor, and the Senate declared Commodus damnatio memoriae to erase him from popular memory. Pertinax struggled to pay the gifts of money that the Praetorians expected, and within a matter of months he too was murdered. In AD 193, after a century of stability, civil war again erupted across the empire, and regional armies battled for the sole rule of Rome. So began the Year of the Five Emperors. The following century was an era of increasing political upheaval for the Roman Empire. Civil wars became more frequent, revenues were interrupted, and the empire entered an era of serious economic decline. The prosperity that Roman merchant fleets had brought back from distant India withered in a world of increased crisis and uncertainty. By AD 227, the Roman tax on international trade was reduced to 1/8, the octava, and the state never again received vast amounts of costly spices and incense. The income that the Flavian emperors had used to build colossal commercial warehouses in the center of Rome was no more. Thanks to the rediscovery of this lost letter by Galen, a unique personal account from the ancient world has been restored to modern scholars and physicians. In his letter on the avoidance of grief, Galen tells his friends how he experienced great loss during his life, but never overindulged in misery. He explains that after the fire, I alone, demonstrating the strong love for work I have felt throughout my life, did not feel overcome with grief. Rather than lament his fate, Galen decided to direct his attentions towards the future and regain the materials he needed to continue his medical work. Galen is believed to have died in AD 217, aged 87. By the time of his death, he had devoted almost 70 years to the study of philosophy and medicine, but had suffered no greater loss than the Great Fire. For further information, see my books, The Roman Empire and the Indian Ocean, 2014, and The Roman Empire and the Silk Routes, 2016. Thank you. Click on the link below to visit my website.